Thank you very much for being with us this morning. The purpose of this morning's meeting was twofold. On one hand, I really wanted all of you to find ways to connect with people that you maybe didn't have the chance to speak at the exhibition yesterday because it was really busy, and that's great for everyone. And the second, I wanted to have a discussion, an online discussion with the head of microelectronics and photonics unit of the European Commission, Ms. Colette Maloney. The reason we want to have this discussion is because in the last weeks, many of you have contacted Optica, and you were wondering why the CHIPS Act in the United States had photonics as a core, and that was not the case for Europe. And why Optica was so engaged with the manufacturing and the CHIPS Act in the US, and we didn't have a strong saying on European part and do the good job that we did in the US, we didn't do it here. There are many reasons for that. What I can tell you is that Optica today is global. So every one of you is part of Optica, and there is no regional focus. What we want to do is to make sure that we connect the world. And everything that we did in the United States, we want to do in Europe. And this is our first step. We want to make sure that we connect you with the right people and that your voice is heard. Today, around half of the room is representing Europe. The other half is representing the United States. And there are ways for a part of it is also coming from different regions in Asia. So the idea here is that we have a global community, and we would like to be heard and to listen to Colette Maloney. Colette, thank you very much for being with us this morning.
Just by way of introduction, I've called the presentation Photonics and the EU CHIPS Act, but as you pointed out to me yesterday, there's not a lot of mention of photonics specifically in the EU CHIPS Act, but that doesn't mean at all that photonics is excluded. And I do hope that it can kind of give you a clearer picture of what it is about, what we are aiming to achieve, and indeed where you can play a role in helping us implement the Act and achieve our goals. And so just into the first slide, and I'm talking a little bit around these slides. Now, our proposal takes into account, of course, the fact that there was a chip shortage. That's what kicked it off. In the first place, but I know there's a US CHIPS Act as well, and just to make a few points about the EU CHIPS Act, it obviously takes into account the EU landscape where we are strong today. It takes into account the gaps we have in Europe in semiconductor technology, and it also takes into account kind of global and geopolitical developments. And what we see particularly in Europe in terms of semiconductor chips is that we do have limited capabilities to produce or manufacture chips in Europe. What is not mentioned in the slide is that we have weaknesses as well compared to other parts of the world. If we compare the US and Europe, for example, we're not so good in the area of design, chips design, certainly when it comes to fabless design, digital design. These are areas where we have gaps today. So that's just a little bit about the origin.
Colette, just so you know, when you said that statement, because maybe you could not see, I could see there were some faces that didn't fully agree with. And I'm known for making people uncomfortable, Colette. So I'm going to go to one of them. There's a company in Italy, that provides fabless photonic integrated circuit manufacturing. I'm going to go all the way back to Photon Path.
Okay, sorry, I didn't hear.
Thank you, Jose, for the intervention. No, my only comment, and you kind of justified, Colette, your mentioning about the market share, and I do agree. However, we as small companies, it would be very, very important and interesting for us to have the support from the EU to keep on with the quality of our designs and designing chips and counting with the nice partners that we have also here in Europe to fabricate those chips. So we do have lots of competencies in design and testing, qualification, and the characterization of not only electrical chips, but also photonic chips. But it would be really, really interesting and helpful to have the support of the EU on that.
Okay, well, I do hope my presentation will help a little bit in that respect. Was basically what we want to do is to create a state-of-the-art European chip ecosystem. And when we refer to chips here, we are basically talking about, semiconductor components, semiconductor-based components. And to reassure people in the audience, when we talk about semiconductors, we have put a definition of semiconductors in our legislative act, and that definition, I won't cite it exactly here, but it refers to components that are intended to perform electronic and photonic functions. So we're not exclusively focusing on electronics. We are focusing also on photonics. We've set 5 particular or specific objectives here. We want to build on and strengthen, the research and technology activities that we have here in Europe. We want to reinforce our capacity to innovate when it comes to design, manufacture, packaging of chips. What we want to do also is to increase substantially production capacity in Europe. And we have set an ambitious goal for that by 2030. The goal we set actually is to have a 20% market share, which is pretty ambitious, to be quite honest. Also that the market is predicted to double by that time as well, from about €500 million today to €1 trillion in 2030. We're very conscious that there is an acute skills shortage. Develop their skills further. And last but not least, what is important, given the shortage that we have set the goal to develop a better understanding of global semiconductor supply chains. And that means working closely with international partners as well.
One quick comment there. I can tell you that in the room right now, we have people from HG Tech, from Sumitomo, from II-VI, from Intel. Those are semiconductor companies from outside Europe who consider themselves photonic companies as well. I can tell you, my feeling is that when I get out of Europe, semiconductor and photonics comes very naturally together. We rarely have Infineon, ST Microelectronics in the room when we discuss the optoelectronics semiconductor production. Is that a part of the roadmap to bring together these two communities closer?
I would think it is. Now, even though the CHIPS Act is not yet adopted, we are preparing the implementation of some of the measures that we have set out in the CHIPS Act. And we actually started with some workshops last week. We will be having a workshop the 29th of this month, which is open, to anybody to attend. And photonics actors are clearly welcome to participate in these preparatory initiatives.
Please tell us who you are and what you...
Yeah, I'm Dr. Eneka Ediar-Barsoum. I'm advising Huawei Technology in France. And I have a very good example because HeSilicon is part of Huawei.
Yes.
They have a manufacturing facility on photonics chips in UK. It's no more European Union, but it's in Europe. And they bought a very big site in Cambridge to build a huge factory in Cambridge to make some optoelectronics components. And because of political issue, they had to put on hold their project. So do you consider that non-European actors could be supported by the European Union to build some chips manufacturing in Europe? Or do you consider it's not in your scope?
First of all, I do have to be precise that we would be supporting production, the setup of manufacturing facilities in the European Union. And second of all, it isn't the union or itself that is providing the funding for the setup of these facilities. This falls under state aid, and the funding support would come directly from the member states. In a nutshell, our CHIPS Act is made up of 3 pillars. So the first pillar is where there are many activities, different activities around research, innovation, capacity building, equity support for startups and small companies. That's pillar 1, and it's called the Chips for Europe initiative. Pillar 2 is about security of supply, and this is what we were just talking about. Boosting, production capacity, manufacturing capacity in the union. And then pillar 3 is about responding to crises, it's really an effort to mitigate the negative effect of future crisis should it arise, monitoring the supply chains and doing that in coordination with member states. It's mainly about making sure that critical sectors, that we can equip them as best as possible with the chips that they need to continue operating. This is pillar 1, the Chips for Europe initiative. And the idea here really is to kind of capitalize on the fact that we do very good R&D in Europe, but to transfer those research outcomes to production at the end of the day. But I would like to be clear to everybody that we are talking about the full supply chain, the full value chain. But to provide them access to the tools, the IPs, etc., that they would need to design and to prototype chips. We also intend to set up pilot lines. We have a number of pilot lines that we've set up in Europe, both in electronics and photonics. The idea is to enhance some of those that we have in place already, and also to develop new ones. And as I said, again, the objective here is to speed this transition from the lab to the fab.
In that slide, Colette, you actually mentioned quantum chips, and that made a few people in the room quite excited. There's a company in the room called QAnt, correct? Wherever you are, please raise your hand. QAnt is actually developing quantum chips with the semiconductor lithium niobate technology. What do you expect from a pilot line that can help QAnt in Europe?
It's Victor Brush from Quant. Yes, I think it's a concept that I think has been tried a couple of times in Europe for different aspects also around photonics. I'm not 100% convinced of it, also by talking to some people that were involved in pilot lines in the past. But I think it would be a great opportunity to build something for quantum chips, because there are several aspects for quantum chips which are not typical to integrated photonics. Like you really need super low losses, superconducting detectors, things like this, which are not standard for regular processes. So I think we would like to see something like this implemented.
Thank you for the comment. So just to mention, in the first workshop, and that was a small workshop by invitation only, just to get us kick-started. We had 2 such workshops. They took place last week, and we'll be publishing a report probably by the end of this week, just a short report on what we've learned. And we will continue to interact with the community at large as we move forward. We did invite to the workshop representatives from quantum technologies as well. I think we had a couple of companies at the table, as well as photonics. Just to reassure the audience that these are areas that we are actively intending to include in the future, once the chip act.
Ron Colette, and he's from our technology scouter from Sony. So I'm very curious. Faisal?
Hi, Colette. I'll reiterate what Jose was saying. He's saying, I'm from Sony, and I have a question for you.
Yeah.
The question is on the pilot line. So it's a great idea to set up these pilot lines. It facilitates the advance of the technology and the scaling up of the entire industry. The issue generally with the pilot line is the standardization of a certain market or a technology. So once you pitch in quantum computing to fill certain gaps, just because it's been a hot theme going on in the sector, how do you sort of compensate for the non-standardization of the non-standardized market and pretty sort of a disintegrated and variegated solutions that come out of it? Because it becomes really almost impossible to standardize a technology market which is very, very disintegrated.
It's a good question. And to be honest, I don't think I can answer your question on the spot. And in order to implement the objectives that we have set, we need to work with a stakeholder community. And as I said, we are kicking off that process. And then the idea is to set up a couple of working groups, per activity, that will help sort of bring us forward and to be able to define the first calls that we would have for proposals, which we expect probably to announce, hopefully to have ready actually, second quarter of next year. One of the issues that came up in those discussions on the pilot lines actually was what you mentioned, standards and how to kind of combine standard setting or integrate that in the process of setting up pilot lines. One of the presentations we had last week was on PIXAP, which is a photonics pilot line. And I think a lot of what they do, in fact, is around standardization. We also want to set up a network of competence centers across Europe. The goals of the competence centers advertising that the pilot lines exist, design platforms exist. We expect that a lot of companies using these, not all, but many of them, will be smaller companies. Certainly that's the case with the design platforms. And we hope that the competence centers are intended to help companies access and participate in these activities. And finally, the fifth objective of the Chips for Europe initiative is to establish a chip funds, loans, grants, equity available to smaller companies. One of the main issues that we want to address is moving technology from the lab to the fab. This schematic just kind of brings together the various ideas that we have. In the middle, you see the pilot lines. You can see on the left-hand side, we just have a list of pilot lines that, that we could imagine being candidates for support. 3 of them on the left-hand side are already mentioned in the CHIPS Act, FDSOI, leading, sub-2 nanometer pilot lines, and heterogeneous systems integration are already named as examples of areas that we would like to address, but there are many others. And we've listed here quantum chips, photonics components, power electronics, etc. I mentioned a design platform as well, where we will be offering tools. We are talking to the main EDA providers. We are talking to providers of IP as well. And as I said, the idea is to set up a platform. We would also like to be able to interlink the design platform and with the pilot lines. There certainly will be synergies because chips are designed using the design platform. We can perhaps produce prototypes using the pilot lines, for example. A little bit more detail also on the CHIPS Fund. On the one hand, we're working with the EIC Accelerator, which is designed to support startups and small companies, and specifically to kind of close the gap between R&D and market take-up. So far, we've proposed to put 300 million euros on the table, and we hope then together with that will then be sort of leveraged by a factor, hopefully, of 3. And we want to be able to make funding available in the form of equity and debt products for both research, innovation, as well as production. Again, we're addressing small companies wishing to scale up. We are putting 125 million is what we are proposing to put on the table, and that will be matched 5-fold. That's what we are hoping will happen.
Good morning.
Okay,
I'm Eric Pennings.
Yes.
I'm a consultant partly in the US and in Europe. So it's great that we have this program and try to do more for the European chips industry. But I'd also be interested in really what the problem is that is causing this shortage, for example. So if I look at the US, then a lot of the logistics has been caused by, too much stimulus together with, the lockdowns that caused, constraints. And those can be solved by financial instruments like raising the interest rate or more stimulus again. But somebody should go down to the port of LA and sort out the mess that is causing a lot of these shortages. So there's the question is what really are causing the shortages, and what logistic measures can be taken other than, say, financial instruments.
We are aware also of the problems, with shipping of chips, materials, etc., especially from Southeast Asia. But for the moment, I mean, we are involved in discussions with various regions of the world. We are holding a dialogue with the US under the Trade and Technology Council. We've also signed a cooperation agreement with Japan, which includes semiconductors. We are talking with Korea, we are talking with Taiwan, and we are talking with Singapore so far in the dialogues we are having. And these issues like logistics problems are coming up. We don't have immediate solutions. And a lot of the actions you will see on the CHIPS Act, put forward in the CHIPS Act, are really aimed at creating more resilience in the supply chain.
I have a further question.
Colette, sorry, this is Douglas from PhotonPath again. When I see your slide, I see mainly the thematic fundings that you've mentioned. And I have two questions. If that also applies, as we are discussing, to photonic companies. And the second question would be about the timing that you imagine to have these funds, this thematic fund is approved both for the EIC Accelerator and for the InvestEU.
Photonics companies are welcome to apply as long as they're in the scope of the call. I can't say a lot yet at this point in time because it's still internal as to what sort of themes or what sort of how focused the call will be. But generally speaking, photonics companies, that are using semiconductor technologies would be eligible.
Colette, can I be 100% honest? Because I will feel really bad if I don't say this. These numbers are very low, and in my opinion, because I'm aware of the other numbers,
I know,
we are not competing.
Yeah. In terms of these particular ones, yeah, we are actually struggling to put money on the table because this happened after the multi-annual financial framework was agreed. We're having to sort of redeploy money also from other parts of the program. So money is tight at the moment.
We have one more question in the room. Ignazio Piacentini.
Ignazio Piacentini, now a consultant, retired recently from an equipment manufacturing company in photonics. I really wanted to make a comment. I am as old as a transistor. So the transistor got commercialized in 1954, my year of birth. And I think that one fact that needs to be acknowledged by the EU is the fact that there is a 40 years gap between semicon and photonics. Mm-hmm. If this is not considered, photonics will be lost in the mare magnum of semicon. And this already happened a few years back when we thought that photonics will end up in ICT. And this is a comment that I think that is very important and maybe should be taken up because I do understand, but in your slide, you're talking about semiconductor, and there is a need to differentiate in this phase. We are now witnessing the convergence of semicon and photonics with co-packagings and so forth. But this is it's not a detail. It's really a point that has to be really considered. Thank you, Colette.
Okay, thanks for the comment. I think I've just one slide here, and it's simply to say that one of our objectives is to increase production capacity in Europe. So we have come up with the first concept of a first-of-a-kind facilities, introduce capabilities in Europe that are not substantially present already in the Union. that definition is fairly wide. A lot of people had the impression that we were looking solely for just leading edge nodes, investment in leading edge nodes, so state-of-the-art semiconductor chips, that it's production of semiconductor chips of any kind as long as they are innovative. So, it can cover power electronics, it can cover MEMS, it can cover, any type of chip, unless, as long as those chips are more innovative than those, produced in Europe today. This is one of the activities, as I said, to increase production capacity. And we are already considering applications here from companies. If I mention the third pillar, I won't go into a lot of detail, but as I said at the beginning, the idea is to get a better understanding of the supply chain in Europe. And to that end, we are working with member states, and the idea is to sort of regularly monitor sort of supply chain activity in Europe. We are doing a mapping of companies across Europe, so in each of the member states, and coming up and defining sort of key performance indicators that will help us identify, shortages or disruptions to the supply chain may be likely. To that end, we set up a semiconductor board, which is simply made up of the Commission and member states.
Colette, one quick question. Who is doing that mapping?
So we are doing that together with the member states. In fact, we rely on the member states. We've asked the member states to provide a list of companies, across the full value chain.
Is there anything that we can do from the photonic industry to make sure that these companies are in that map?
I guess the best thing to do would be to contact your member state representatives. Because as I said, this is something that we have tasked the member states with.
We normally go to our national contact points and we want them to make sure that the proposal is good enough. So we know how to reach them. If you don't know your national contact point, your country, just contact me. I know all of them. Super nice people. Thank you, Colette.
As I said, I will skip quickly to the next slide, which is simply just to say where we are. I think of just a couple more slides where we are today. The state of play of negotiations of the CHIPS Act. So the discussions are ongoing in two council working groups, the industry working group where we are negotiating the CHIPS Act regulation, and also the research working group, because part of what we want to do with the CHIPS Act is expand the current joint undertaking, the KDT joint undertaking, which I'm sure some of you will know. We are doing our own work, as I mentioned, in parallel. I mentioned now we are going to set up working groups, defining pilot lines, what they should look like, what they can do, the key characteristics of pilot lines. The question on standards, of course, asked earlier, these are the type of issues that we would be addressing in this working group that we want to, the setup of which we want to announce shortly. Same for the design platform. How will we set it up? How will we make it secure, trusted? What functionalities will it offer? Who should it target, etc.? That's all. Now we are in the phase where we are going to set up a working group as well. We will be organizing a conference, mostly for member states, on the competence centers and how we can set up a network of competence centers across Europe. Many of you might be aware of the digital innovation hubs that are spread across Europe today. We don't want to reinvent the wheel with competence centers, so we will try to build on what exists already and see what we can learn from the existing digital innovation hubs and how we can possibly build on those. So we will have a workshop with member states mostly, but also digital innovation hubs and other stakeholders, including industry and researchers, probably at the beginning of December this year. And as I mentioned, for the CHIPS Fund, we are beginning to define the calls now. So these are the sort of activities we are already starting, just so that you know that you can engage with us on any of these things. And finally, just to mention a couple of this is the last slide, ongoing initiatives that we have. We also have IPCEI, which is a type of a state aid project. IPCEI means Important Project of Common European Interest. It's a big project, many billions of euros funding coming directly from member states. It's on microelectronics and connectivity, but I can tell you there are many photonics companies participating in this IPCEI. Companies are welcome to send proposals on photonics. We actually, to encourage that, we have a call open on silicon photonics. At the moment, it's a special focus topic that we published in part to encourage the community to participate. And yeah, I just mentioned as well a couple of examples of pilot lines that we have that we're supporting under Horizon Europe. I hope that that's correct.
I really want to be very respectful with your time. You told me to finish exactly at 9, and I know it's 3 minutes past 9. If there are any final questions, please raise your hand. I would like to give two quick thoughts to you, Colette. The first one is that today in the room, we have some of the, I think, in my opinion, pioneering startups that are looking now to get investment, and they're getting that investment from outside Europe. And some of them are in the room, I'm not going to mention, but you know who I'm talking about. And they are growing very fast. They are leading, they are unique. They have developed the technology in many cases with EU funds. And now to grow up, they are looking outside. And the reason for that is that the amount of investment that is coming from outside Europe is so much bigger than the numbers that we normally are hearing. So that's my first concern. And my second concern is I heard last week the counterpart presentation from the American CHIPS Act. And I honestly, from the bottom of my heart, I think it's important that the two of you sit together and that you leverage what both of you are doing and to find a way to have a more common way of addressing this very important, this critical issue. That would be my honest feedback here, and I will be more than happy to provide that kind of platform. I have a question for all of you. Who is coming to OFC this year? For those of you who are coming to OFC, do you think it's interesting for Optica to organize a similar event like this one, but with the US Congress? Just for those of you who raise your hand, just make sure that you are there because we will do it, of course. Otherwise, I wouldn't say it. I hope to see you at OFC, and all of you have a fantastic exhibition and conference today. And Colette, thank you very much. Thank you.